Good morning and welcome to 10 Minutes with Kiptanet, a premier podcast that discusses matters data protection and privacy in Kenya and around the globe. I am Meshak Masibe and I'll be your presenter for today. So today the core of our presentation, the core of our discussion will be the Data Protection Act 2019 and what it means for you, for your business, for your organization and for the government and for just every entity that is within the confines of the jurisdiction of Kenya. So the Data Protection Act is a piece of legislation that was enacted in the year 2019 by the Kenyan Parliament. It was a result of a 10-year conversation around just the importance to protect personal data and personal information locally. And even as we ship it outside the continent, there was a need for just a framework just protect our personal data. And that's why people came together, the relevant stakeholders came together in Parliament and they enacted the Data Protection Act. And that is why you have a Data Protection Act 2019. It is not the only legislation, it is the core legislation, but it's not the only legislation that is in place. There is equally the Data Protection Act Regulations 2021, the Data Protection Act Registration of Processors and Controllers Regulations as well, and also there are numerous other guidelines and frameworks that have been enacted and implemented by the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner to just supplement and make more robust the local data protection regime. So what is data? I think that's the first question you have to answer. Data, and particularly personal data, is information that belongs to you as an individual or to an entity or to a group of people or a company that is unique to that person, to that company, to that entity, and it has the capacity to identify you to a third party. An example of personal data is your phone number, your email address, your huduma number, your passport number. These are unique information. This is rather unique information that has the power and capacity to identify you to a random person, to a company, to an individual. So why is it important to safeguard this information? It is important to put safeguards on this information because it is inherent to the right to privacy that you're able to control who is able to access information about you, is able to access you through the information you provide. It's supposed to be within your control and your mandate. So Data Protection Act is an act that is primarily centered on the principle of consent and something called informed consent. What consent is, it's basically saying that for any information that belongs to you, before someone else can take that information or use that information, they have to acquire your consent, and this consent has to be informed. The Act also talks about someone called a data subject, which is just basically what I've described. So you, in the situation, the owner of the data or information that is being used, or rather is being processed or is just about to be used, and it's called a data subject. That is the first term that I want us to just discuss in these 10 minutes, a data subject. An example of a data subject is you. For instance, in 2020, the government ran a program to enroll Kenyans to the Huduma number, the National Information Management System, NIMS, through the Huduma number registration system. So in that context, you are a data subject. You are the person to whom the information belongs, which the government was trying to acquire from you. So in that situation, you're a data subject. Another thing that I want us to discuss and just to clarify and to bring into life is the concept of a data controller. A data controller is a person who controls your personal data, who has the power to determine how your information is used. First, they control your information. Secondly, have the power to determine how your information is used. An example of a data controller is your employer. When you are employed and get a job with a new place or something along those lines, what you're normally asked for are your NHIF and NSSF details. What this essentially means, you're giving them to your employer to make the necessary remittances at the end of the month. What you now give them is the power to control your information. So in that setup, they are called a data controller. Another important concept that we need to discuss and just to break down is the concept of a data processor. A data processor is someone who processes information on behalf of the data controller under their instructions. So for instance, if your employer has an auditor to assess to audit their accounts and their personnel and whatnot, when they are auditing the accounts and they have to check that your NHIF remittances were made or your NSSF remittances were made, in that situation, the audit firm ideally is a data controller. So those are the three key terms I want us to really discuss, to really understand in terms of the Data Protection Act, because there are terms that you will see time and time again being discussed in the Act and just in different sections. So this is a data processor, this is a data controller, this is a data subject, and that is what they mean. Secondly, we want to discuss the key terminologies that are just key in the Data Protection Act. You'll notice them just all through the Act. If you're reading the Act, you'll notice different terminologies and just different phrases that you may want to understand what they mean. One of the terminologies that are there is called data processing. So data processing, for the lay persons who are not really techies or people in the technological space, data processing just means processing your information. In the same way you process food, for instance. Let's say someone takes pig and then a pig is slaughtered and then it's processed into sausages. The transformation of your raw data. So in that context, the example I've given, your raw data is a pig. So that's the raw data that you have. When the pig is slaughtered for commercial use, it's the same way your data is extracted by a company, by government, for a particular end or purpose. So processing is the process by which the pig is slaughtered and then it's transformed into a sausage. So that is what processing basically means. That is data processing. Another key term that is important to learn about is the concept of principles of data protection. There are a number of principles that just govern the whole data protection regime in Kenya. There is data minimization. There's another principle we'll discuss a bit about called data localization. We'll talk about data transparency. We'll talk about data integrity. We'll talk about data integrity. We'll talk about data accountability. So what is data transparency? What is, you can just start in the mix, just what is data transparency? Data transparency, it's a principle that requires the use of data to be open and transparent. Just in a basic sense that if you need to know, you need to be aware how your data is being used, who is using that information, how they're using it, and what they're using it for. A clear example of where this principle is important is in the elections. In Kenya, in the 2022 elections, rather in the 2017 elections, there were whole issues around where voter data was being held. If you were keen and you watched the proceedings, the Supreme Court, you'd hear them say, we can't be able to access the data about how people voted and whatnot. So data transparency, it's a principle that says that basically in such a situation, as a voter, you should be able to see your results in real time, able to access where that data is stored, and able to know that it's being stored and used transparently. Another principle that we want to really just understand and discuss about is a principle called data minimization. Data minimization is a principle that says that if you're a data processor or data controller and you have to process data belonging to a data subject, you have to take the bare minimum data, nothing more. If you are collecting information for a particular purpose, it should be for that particular purpose. An example of this is in the SIM card registration process that was recently the talk of town recently. So what data minimization means for that, it means that when the Communications Authority of Kenya said that they just needed the details of mobile subscribers in the local context, they said that in a sense, they specified what they needed. So Safaricom and Airtel and all the other telcos came together and put in extra requirements of a picture. So the Communications Authority of Kenya did not require anyone to put in a picture as part of the registration process. So by the telcos, Safaricom, Airtel and the rest just requiring for a picture, that means they violated the principle of data minimization, because they're taking data beyond the bare minimum that is required. They're taking information that is not in accordance with the original intended collection purposes. That is data minimization. The other principle that I'd like us to discuss today is called data localization. What data localization means, and essentially is a principle that says that you're supposed to, when you are processing data for the purposes of a public good, such as an election, you're supposed to process this data and store this data in a server that has a server locally within the country. This is very important because if you remember in 2017, one of the core issues was that the servers that was holding voter information are located in France, and people in court and saying we need to access the servers, and someone would say, another lawyer would say that the people who operate the servers are asleep and it's in France. So that's part of why the data localization requirement was introduced in the Act, and it requires data to be stored locally in servers in Kenya, or in alternative a copy to be, or not even an alternative, and additionally a copy of that data to be stored also locally, even if it's being exported. Let's say if it's being exported elsewhere, a copy of the data that is being exported elsewhere should be kept locally. That is another principle, that is data localization. Data accountability, it's tied in with data transparency. It's just the idea that a processor, a controller of data should be accountable for how they use the data, they collect, and should be able to answer and say, this is how we use the data we collected, this is how we processed it, this is how we used it, and these were the purposes for which it was used and collected and processed, and this is our outcomes, and this is what we did and whatnot. So that is essentially a data processor. That is essentially the role of a data processor, and those are the principles that guide those roles. The principle also of data integrity, it's highly correlated to the whole principle of data transparency and very related, and at the core, they're just principles that just talk about openness. Data should be used openly with utmost integrity, and just in a way that you're able to trace your roots, trace the roots of how the data was acquired, collected, processed up to the end stage, and then converted to meaningful data and what it was used for. So these are the core principles of data protection that I just want us to just understand today, for this 10 minutes of today, to just understand what they are and what they mean. An additional thing that may be important for you to understand just for this first point of introduction is that the rights of a data subject. Who is a data subject? Who is a data subject? A data subject is you, it's me, it's any individual who owns data and who gives this data to another entity. So they have a data subject primarily has different roles and so it has different duties and also has very many rights as outlined under the Data Protection Act. So one of the core things, it's what I started with, the need for consent. Like they have a right to consent for every use of their data. If your information is being taken by an employer, is being taken by the government, you need to be able to consent to it. That's why when you're talking about the Huduma number case, the court say that the government cannot coerce someone to take the Huduma number or constructively coerce someone to take the Huduma number if they have not consented to it. So it's important that as a data subject you must consent to data being acquired. Likewise, even the telcos, Airtel and Safaricom cannot ask for your picture without your consent. And that's why there are a number of issues around the SIM card registration process, because they are asking for your details without your consent. Yeah, that is important to note. Thirdly, secondly, the other right over data subject is the right to access. As a data subject, you have the right to access your data and where it's being stored. For instance, if your employer has stored your NHIF record somewhere, you have a right to tell them, you need to show me the exact details of how the remittances you've been making and at which date and the reference codes and whatnot. You have a right, your right to access your data to see how it's being processed, and after accessing and seeing how it's being processed, now you have a right to also have a copy of the said data. So you have a right, number one, to consent to your use of the data. Number two, you have a right to access the data. Number three, you have a right to report a data breach. The core ones we want to discuss today. So reporting a data breach means basically where you feel like your data has been, your information has been shared without your consent or illegally. You have a right to file a complaint to the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner. After filing the complaint to the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner, you can pursue all the methods that are provided for under the Data Protection Act, under the guidances that are provided by the ODPC, and thereafter you can receive a remedy that will be given to you by the Data Protection Commissioner. You also have a right to appeal that decision to another court if you're not satisfied, and just follow the procedures that are in line with the law. Thank you for today. Those are the key concepts we just want you to understand. I want you to understand about data protection and Data Protection Act and just everything that surrounds it. Thank you. This is 10 Minutes with Kictanet. Thank you for your time.